When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Sidetrack episode 35, when Francis met Kyrill. Welcome back to A to Z History Presents the History of the Papacy. This sidetrack episode is the first and hopefully many more episodes on the historical background for current events involving the popes and Christian church in general. It is a little dangerous talking about current events, but it is something I've wanted to do for a long time, but I've always been sidetracked, so to speak, by other projects. Now it's time to dig in. I want to really thank Joseph Charneski from the History Podcast Facebook group for posting an article from the BBC that is the starting point for this episode. Definitely a big thank you to you, Joseph. I very much appreciate it. The BBC article was so thin, historically speaking, it just had to be further investigated. This short article only has 4 small paragraphs. Here is the first paragraph, quote, "The Pope and the Russian Orthodox Patriarch will meet in Cuba on Friday, the first encounter between the heads of the two churches since they split in the 11th century. The only meaningful part of that quote is the part about the two prelates meeting on Friday. They actually did meet on Friday, February 11th, 2016, in the Havana, Cuba airport of all places. Sounds like as good a place as any, I suppose. I wish I could have gone as a correspondent. This meeting is a historical meeting for many different reasons, just not for any of the reasons stated in the quote above. Saying this was the first encounter between the heads of the two churches since the 11th century conceals layers of actual interesting history. Don't get me wrong, this meeting between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill is absolutely important, just not for the time period between the meetings of their respective churches. They issued statements on all sorts of hot-button issues such as the crisis for Christians in the Middle East, euthanasia, marriage issues, ecumenism, and the situation in Ukraine. I've added a link to the show notes to the official joint letter issued by the Pope and Patriarch if you'd like to learn more. In the opening line of the joint statement, they say this meeting is, quote, the first in history. They don't really explain much more than that, but there definitely is more to say on the matter. And after listening to this episode, I highly encourage you to look at the show notes to start your own search. The Rus, or the Russians, converted to Christianity like many European groups did. They were influenced by the remnants of the Roman Empire and the sophistication of Mediterranean culture. The short story is the Rus attacked Constantinople, but they also traded with them. It was that trade that almost required them to drop their native Slavic paganism in order to plug into the Mediterranean world. The Rus were introduced to Christianity not through the Latin West as the Germanic groups were, but through the Greek East. That changed the whole orientation of Russian Christianity. The Russians were aligned towards Constantinople in the east and not to the Pope in Rome. The traditional date for the conversion of the Rus to Christianity is in 988 AD, when Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev was baptized. The Grand Prince's conversion didn't fall out of the clear blue sky. There had been missionary activity among the Rus for the better part of a century, but it took some time for the conversion to really kick into high gear. The Russians were just converted to Christianity at the dawn of the 11th century. The Russian Church at this point did not technically have a leader in its own right. The Church of Russia was governed by the Patriarch in Constantinople. For over 400 years, the patriarchs in Constantinople appointed a metropolitan bishop to the Russians. Something very important did happen in the 11th century. In 1054, the Great Schism between the Eastern and Western Church occurred. It was a breakup that was long in the making, but the split officially went down in Constantinople in 1054 with mutual anathemas. Russia wasn't directly involved in this action, but since Russia was under the umbrella of the Patriarch of Constantinople, they were involved whether they liked it or they didn't. The Great Schism of 1054 was only about 70 years after the Rus were even converted to Christianity. These Rus were not power players in the Christian world at this time. They were still wet behind the ears from their baptism. If the Pope were to meet with the leader of the Russian Church, he would have to meet with the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Russian Church would eventually grow and become a strong movement, but it would take time and the collapse of the Eastern Byzantine Empire. The communion of the Eastern Orthodox churches works a little differently than the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope is the supreme and ultimate religious leader of all Roman Catholics. The Catholic Church is based in countless countries around the world: Poland, Ireland, the Philippines, the USA, UK, France, African nations, etc., etc. But the Pope is the leader of all of them. They call it direct and ordinary control. This is not so in Orthodoxy. In the Orthodox world, many national churches are self-governing. The term they use is autocephalous, self-heading. What happens is churches are established, and then after they have reached a certain state, they are granted this autocephaly by their mother church, and then the autocephaly is agreed upon by the other autocephalous churches. This process takes time, and as you would expect, has a political element to it. Some examples of autocephalous national churches are Russia, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Romania, the country of Georgia, and others. One of the central parts of autocephaly is that the individual autocephalous churches elect or select its own leaders. A series of events that we will speak to in just a moment led to the Church of Russia in 1448 to appoint their own metropolitan archbishop without the input of Constantinople. This trend of selecting their own leader continued after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Russia just went for it alone, being that the church in Constantinople had plenty of problems of their own. Over the course of the 1400s, the focus of power of the Russian state moved from Kiev to Moscow. As the state power went, so did the religious power. The grand princes were in Moscow, and so were the metropolitan. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World
I
off.
praise the man.
K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hello, I'm David Jeremiah. And after 250 years, America has much to celebrate. But this time is also a moment to seek the Lord, because the hope of a nation is not found merely in outward strength, but in hearts that are turned toward God. Scripture reminds us that revival begins when God's people humble themselves in prayer, seek His face, and walk in Christ's ways. That is where lasting strength begins. So, as we thank God for America's past, let us also ask Him for spiritual renewal in our future. May He lead us, strengthen us, and pour out His blessing on this land we so dearly love.
Moving ahead very quickly, about 150 years later, a council of Orthodox patriarchs officially proclaimed the church in Russia as autocephalous and elevated the metropolitan archbishop to patriarch of all Russia. They moved up Russia in the list of churches right under Jerusalem. There were many reasons why the patriarchs of Constantinople and the other bishops of the major eastern sees did this. Namely, that Russia was rich and powerful, whereas they were under the domination of the Ottoman Empire. This decision has influenced European and world politics ever since. Let's check where we stand right now. On one technicality, the article is correct. Two men with the exact titles of Pope of Rome and Patriarch of Moscow had up to this time never met face to face. That's not exactly the same as saying the Pope of Rome and the leader of the Russian Church had never met in purpose before, though. To find out about the time when the leader of these two churches actually did meet, we have to go back just a bit before the Russian Church went off and elected their own metropolitan archbishop without the input of the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1448. Let's back up just about a decade to the late 1430s. The city of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire were just about finished. The Byzantine Emperor John Palaiologos figured he had one last chance to get the Western European powers to call a crusade and maybe, just maybe, keep the Byzantine Empire alive a bit longer. So John went, with his hat in his hand, to the Council of Ferrara, Florence. I won't go into all the details of this particular council, but it was a multi-year council that dealt with many messy details of church and secular politics Europe had been mired in for at least a century. Emperor John went on the grand tour of Western Europe trying to drum up some military support to help the Byzantine Empire just make it a little bit further, but no real support was coming. Look, England and France were winding down the 100 Years' War and were exhausted. Spain was in the middle of wrapping up the Reconquista. The Holy Roman Empire and France were in conflict. This council was actually held to help clean up after the Avignon papacy and all that entailed. This was just not a good time for Western Europe to be able to pitch in and help Constantinople. This is where things really heat up. The Patriarch of Constantinople appointed a new metropolitan of Russia. This man was a Greek monk named Isidore. If you want to look him up, he goes by a couple of different titles, depending on the source. Roman Catholic sources call him Cardinal Isidore of Thessalonica. Orthodox sources call him Isidore the Apostate. I think this gives you a pretty good idea where things are going. Isidore went to Russia after his appointment and was told by the Russian princes and clergy that he really had one job, and that was to protect the independence and prestige of Russia and the Russian Church. In short, Isidore was not to embarrass Russia. Isidore and a complement of bishops from around the Orthodox world journeyed to Italy for the council. The Pope acted in a haughty manner toward the Orthodox and the Easterners in general at this council from the word go. The Pope at this time was acting in a haughty manner generally, given a host of attacks upon papal power that this council was sorting out and trying to get rid of. The Pope really had to stay very strong during this time or his power was going to corrode away rapidly. The Pope basically put out the deal to the Byzantines and the Easterners. He said, look, we'll give you some help, but the Orthodox Church has to form a union with the Roman Church, with the Pope at the head of it all. Emperor John and many of the bishops, including Isidore, were like, sure, no problem. The Pope made Isidore a cardinal priest, and shortly afterward, he traveled back to Russia to enforce the new union. The first thing Isidore did when he got back to Russia was hold a liturgy in which he named the Pope and the prayers for the hierarchs and paraded around a Latin cross. He then passed around a letter to all the bishops stating that Russia was now in a union with Rome. I can imagine steam shooting out of the collars and the eyes of the grand princes, the bishops, and even the laity. All of this was just too much for them. Union was the last thing Isidore was supposed to do, and he comes back to Russia with a humiliating union at that. Russia was enjoying her independence. Constantinople was important, but it wasn't worth giving up so much. Isidore was promptly imprisoned and removed as metropolitan. This Isidore character had a major streak of the character MacGyver in him. He was able to escape his Russian confinement and moved across Russia, Eastern Europe, and back to Rome. He was sent as a part of the papal legation to Constantinople just in time for the fall of the city to the Ottoman Turks. Isidore was even able to escape this terrible situation. Isidore dressed up a corpse in his full cardinal regalia, dressed himself up as a commoner, and escaped the city on a boat. When Isidore arrived back to Rome, he was heaped with all sorts of titles, including Latin Patriarch of Constantinople. That title always stuck in the craw of the Orthodox because of the unpleasantness of the Fourth Crusade. Really, if you count the meeting between Isidore and the popes, we have at least one meeting between the head of the Russian Church and the papacy. This unfortunate event was the first step on a very long, rocky relationship between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. You can see why neither party would want to trumpet that first meeting. As I said, this was just the first of the beginning of a sour relationship between these two powerful churches. The Russian and Roman churches are going to bump heads again and again over the next 600 years, up to the present day. The main flashpoint of this conflict was and is in and around Ukraine. In a follow-up episode, we will look at why there's been so much animosity between Catholics and Orthodox in the region of the Ukraine and the Baltics. The centuries-long tension between these two churches is probably the biggest reason why this meeting between Kyrill and Francis is so important, easily overshadowing the amount of meetings or the time interval between those meetings. If you come across an article on current events related to church history you'd like to find out more background on, send it to me and I'll do the legwork for you. You'll get a big shout out and we can all learn together. You can email, Facebook, and tweet the article to all the usual places. Find them at a2zhistorypage.com.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off, K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.